Fall is my favorite time of year, and one of the ways I like to embrace it is by making heartier meals like soups and stews and cooking with seasonal produce. So today I invite you into my kitchen as I cook 4 recipes that will help us embrace this new autumn season. This first recipe is a fall harvest veggie grain bowl. Say that 5 times fast. And I like this one because of how colorful it turns out to be. So the first thing I did was go ahead and prep all of my ingredients. There is a lot of chopping involved in this recipe, but it goes pretty quickly. So you're just going to peel and chop your carrots up into small bite-sized pieces, and then halve or quarter your Brussels sprouts depending on how big they are. For the red onion, just peel it, cut off the root ends, cut it in half, and then slice it into 1/4-inch slices. Toss your chopped veggies onto a baking sheet, and then zest 1 lemon and cut it into quarters because you're also going to roast some of the lemon pieces to make a dressing later. Half of the lemon juice is going to go into a small container to make a dressing. Onto the baking sheet, we're going to add some fresh thyme sprigs, some olive oil, and lots of ground black pepper and salt. Give everything a good toss, and then you're going to roast it in the oven for about 20 to 25 minutes, and be sure to give it a good stir about halfway through. While the veggies are roasting, it's time to make the farro. So what I did was boil some chicken broth or chicken stock. You can just use regular water, and I think it's really important to rinse your farro because it can be a little bit dusty. So I rinsed that off really well, and then I'm going to boil it in my chicken broth with a little bit of salt. And the nice thing about farro is you don't have to have exact water to farro measurements because you can just drain it once it's cooked all the way. And I like to cook it just to al dente, but cook it as long as you feel comfortable until it is the right consistency for you. Now to our small measuring cup of lemon juice, we're going to add some olive oil, a little bit of sugar, salt and pepper, and whisk it up to make a lemon vinaigrette. And then when the farro is just about done, you're going to add in your dried cherries. I just love the taste of these dried cherries. They get nice and plump mixed in with the farro, and they have a nice tartness but also a little bit of sweetness. It's a nice addition. In a medium-sized bowl, we're going to make a lemon feta dressing for the farro. And this is where you take the lemon wedges that have been roasted and you push them to kind of get some of the juice out, and then add some water, olive oil, salt and pepper, and feta, and mix it all together. Into this dressing goes the farro with the cherries, and we're also going to add in some pepitas as well. Go ahead and pick the thyme sprigs from the vegetables, and then it's time to plate up our dish. Start by spooning in the farro mixed with the feta lemon dressing. Top with your roasted vegetables, top with some more feta, some more pepitas, and some thyme. Oops, we almost forgot the lemon vinaigrette. This is a very nice, hearty, bright dish, and it's nice that it's vegetarian, but it's still so filling, and there's so many different flavors going on. It's a very complex meal, but it's not difficult to make, so this is definitely one of my favorites, and I've made this a few times before. Alright, moving on to recipe number 2, we are making creamy chicken and gnocchi dumplings with pot pie gravy. This one is really easy. So the first thing I did was just boil my gnocchi to soften them up, and I wanted to also try to crisp them up. So I softened them first and then drained it, and then I tried to saute them in olive oil, and they did get a little bit stuck to the bottom, but I think it was worth it to keep it from being too gummy. But you can definitely skip that step and just do your boiled gnocchi on the side and mix it in with your other ingredients. My gnocchi only took a couple minutes, so after that I quickly peeled my carrot and chopped it up, and most of these recipes this week have carrot in them, and that's because I like to repeat ingredients, especially because we shop at Aldi and most of their produce comes in bulk, so I like to reuse it as many times as I can that week to try to use it all up. So in my pan, I just added some butter in addition to the oil that was already in there, so I could saute up my carrots. And while my carrots are starting, I'm going to chop up a yellow onion, just dice it up small, and that will go right into the pan with the carrots and soften up. At this point, I added some freshly ground black pepper and salt, and I really like to add the black pepper to the oil so that it can bloom and really become more flavorful. I also added some thyme sprigs to the oil so that they can also fry up a little bit, And again, we're gonna remove the thyme after a while, but for now it's just gonna flavor the food. Then I just pushed my veggies to the side and made sure there's a little bit of oil down in the pan. And I cut up some chicken tenderloins right into the pan. You can do this ahead of time, but I wanted to save myself the step of washing a cutting board, so I just used kitchen scissors and cut the chicken up and put it right in there. Now to make the pot pie gravy, I again used some chicken stock. The recipe calls for all milk, but I just wanted to use some chicken stock up. So I did half chicken stock, half milk, and then to the pan I added a couple tablespoons of flour in with the butter and the oil. Let that cook for about a minute, and then whisk in my milk mixture and cook it over medium-ish heat until it thickens up. Then goes in some frozen peas, and once those are warmed up, add back in the gnocchi, and it's pretty much it. I did top mine with some freshly chopped parsley, but that's totally optional. And I really like this dish as an alternative to chicken pot pie. If you don't feel like making biscuits or you don't have any puff pastry on hand, maybe you want to use up some gnocchi that you have in your pantry. It's just a nice little change up. Alright, moving on to recipe number 3, we have a saucy Hungarian red potato goulash. I really like this one as well. It was really tasty. So I started by heating up some oil in my pan and slicing up some smoked kielbasa from Aldi, and I like to slice it pretty thin and at an angle so that it has more surface area to brown. Something I try to remember is that brown in cooking equals flavor. So if you can get some caramelization on your meat especially, or some crunch, I think it always tastes better than being like rubbery or mushy. So definitely try to get some brown and some crust on the meats. But anyway, then I just chopped up a white onion and I sliced that up so that it's ready to go while my meat was cooking. I also threw in a French baguette into the oven, just directly onto the oven rack, because the author of this recipe suggested serving the goulash with some bread. So at this point my meat was already browned and it was fully cooked to begin with, so I was really just getting some color on there and heating it up all the way through. So I removed that and put it in a separate bowl and tried to leave as much of the oil in the pan as I could. Then I added 2 tablespoons of butter so that I could saute my onions, and I just put the onions right in there, and those are going to cook for a while to get nice and brown and soft. While my onions are sauteing, I prepped my potatoes, so I just rinsed them all off, and I used small yellow potatoes as well as small red potatoes because that's what we had at Aldi. And it tasted perfectly fine. The author said to peel them before you slice them, but I did not find that to be necessary. Oh, baby boy is moving around. He's been moving around so much lately. It always stops me in my tracks. But anyway, then I sliced up my potatoes as thinly as possible. I cut them in half first to keep them from rolling away, and it definitely helped. So I recommend doing that. But I just chopped them all up. And at this point, I realized that I was running out of space, so I had to transfer over to the Dutch oven so that I could finish up this recipe. I also needed to prep some garlic, and the fastest way for me to peel garlic is just to smash it with the side of my knife. I'm sure you guys have seen me do this plenty of times before, but it just kind of smashes it up, releases the allicin, and then I chop it all up into small little pieces, and that's going to go into my pan with my sauteed onions. Then into the pan with the onions and garlic goes some salt, some freshly ground pepper, and some paprika. And I always like to add spices before liquids so that spices have time to bloom a little bit in the oil. But then after about a minute and everything's smelling fragrant, then I add the broth and the potatoes. After your broth comes to a simmer, you're going to let it cook for about 15 minutes with the lid askew, stirring once or twice, trying not to break the potatoes too much, and then take the lid off and let it cook another 10 minutes to let the goulash really thicken up. When you feel like it's at a good consistency, then you add the sausages back in and you're pretty much done. All that's left to do is slice the bread and get that ready and put the goulash into bowls. I topped it with some fresh parsley, and then I set the table with candles, and we enjoyed a nice rainy fall evening. For our 4th and final recipe, we are making an immunity boosting miso ginger pumpkin soup, and because I'm extra like that, I decided to try to make my own bread as well. which actually did turn out, so I highly recommend these recipes. But for the bread, I just started with some warm water and a pack of active dry yeast, and then I let that bubble up for about 10 minutes, and while that was bubbling or activating, I measured out my flour, and I did 50% regular all-purpose flour and 50% bread flour, and it worked out really well. And then into my dry ingredients, I also added some salt, and Maggie really wanted to be involved in this, so she helped me a little bit as well. After 10 minutes of the yeast activating with the warm water and the sugar, I added in my flour and salt and mixed that up with a bread hook. I tried not to over mix it, and I also tried to make sure it was not too sticky and not too dry. It's definitely hard to find the right balance, especially depending on your climate, where you live, and that's always been my struggle with bread before, but I'm happy to say this time it turned out. So we just left the dough in the bowl, covered it with a kitchen towel, and let it hang out for about an hour while we worked on the soup. So for the soup base, we're not quite doing a mirepoix because there's no celery, but we are going to do a yellow onion chopped up, as well as I added carrots because I had them on hand, and I feel like it went really well with the sweet potato and the pumpkin, and you can never go wrong with too many vegetables and vitamins in your food. So yeah, we added some carrots and we just chopped everything up really small so that it would be cooking down about the same rate. Now, if you've ever chopped up a sweet potato, you know it can be a little dangerous. So my recommendation is to make sure your knife is sharp and try to cut it in half first so that you can get a flat edge, and just be careful. I mean, potatoes, sweet potatoes especially, they can be a little tricky. So yes, this recipe does have a fair amount of chopping, but I feel like it goes pretty quickly. So I also needed to chop up some garlic, so I just peeled it again, minced it up really well, and then I peeled some fresh ginger, and half of the ginger I'm going to cut into matchsticks, and the other half I'm going to mince about the same size as the garlic. And we're actually going to make a fried ginger topping, and we're going to use the ginger oil that we use to fry the ginger matchsticks, and we're going to use that as our base for our soup. So I just put my ginger matchsticks into a microwave safe container and covered it with oil. I just used vegetable oil and microwaved it for about 3 minutes until the ginger was brown. And then I removed the ginger and put it on a paper towel lined plate and reserved the oil for the next step. For the next step, we're going to make a miso broth. So I just did 3 cups of warm water and a couple of tablespoons of white miso paste. You can find it at most international grocery stores, or especially Asian grocery stores. And if you don't have it, I would use vegetable broth or chicken broth in its place. Alright, into my Dutch oven, I poured in the reserved ginger oil carefully because my glass measuring cup was very hot. And then I sauteed my onions over medium-high heat, and the oil was already pretty hot, which is nice. And then I seasoned it with salt and pepper, of course, and then added in my garlic and ginger and let that cook and soften for a little bit. And then went in some cumin, my miso broth, 1 can of unsweet pumpkin puree, my sweet potatoes, and my carrots. And then all of that just needed to simmer on medium-low with the lid askew again until everything inside was soft, because later on we're going to use an immersion blender to blend it all up. So you just want to make sure everything's nice and soft. Now it's time to get back to bread making. So it's been about an hour at this point, and my bread dough had doubled in size, and I had a pan in the oven preheating at 450 degrees. So all we're going to do is divide this in half because this does make 2 loaves, and it was a little bit sticky, so I had to add a little bit more flour, but eventually I got it cut into 2 loaves, and I put each blob onto the tray. Another trick that the author of the bread recipe had was to put a pan with some water in it underneath this one, and it actually helped to make a crust on the bread. So definitely follow the directions and read all the notes in the recipe if you make this one. Alright, after my soup was done simmering, it's time to use the immersion blender to get it all smooth. If you don't have an immersion blender, it's fine. Just very carefully transfer it to a regular blender and make it all smooth. And then to serve, they recommended some sesame seeds, some cilantro, the fried ginger matchsticks, and of course, we're gonna have our freshly baked bread on the side. Another note about the bread is they recommend letting it sit for an hour before you cut into it, so definitely take that into account if you plan on serving this at the same time as your soup. But yes, we are coming to the end of today's video. I just want to say thank you guys so much for spending this time with me and for watching to the end. If you like this kind of video, let me know what you think in the comments down below. And let me know if you plan to make any of these recipes. I'll of course link them all in the description. But I just want to say thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye guys!